And what we're going to do is have a brief introduction. I'm going to introduce our panel, and then we're going to have a discussion about some of these topics. So when securing critical infrastructure, we know that this is one of the top priorities for the federal, the state, and local governments, as well as for commercial providers of all of the communications, financial, electric, and other services that are provided. So practical approaches for securing these increasingly distributed and complex and richly connected critical infrastructures have been sought after by many different cybersecurity research and development programs, specifically those that aim to promote the robust and effective design and construction of cyber-physical systems and infrastructures. So as critical infrastructure continues to be built and refreshed, those that are involved in making decisions face a number of different challenges regarding the ways to identify, to analyze, and to prepare for the wide variety of threats and hazards that they may face, for mitigating vulnerabilities and minimizing potential impacts and consequences of any attack or failure. And this presents a wide range of complex challenges. The larger and the more complex our systems and networks become, the more potentially vulnerable they become, which inevitably leaves them susceptible to a wide variety of cybersecurity exposures. So there's an increasingly important need, particularly in light of the growth and the complexity and connectivity of critical infrastructure sectors, for developing rigorous and practical methods and tools for determining whether such systems are sufficiently protected from the different cyber threats. So today we're going to be discussing these kinds of topics, and I'm going to introduce our panel. So our first panelist is James Bach. He is a master's student and an Erickson Fellow. James has a bachelor's degree in computer systems engineering from Carleton University, and his research explores the use of formal models and component-based software engineering to verify secure system designs. James, if you can say hi so that people can see you on this live stream.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here.
Our next panelist is Bodana Sereda. She's a master's student and the recipient of a MITAC's Global Link Graduate Fellowship. She has a Bachelor of Cybersecurity from Tereshevchenko National University of Kiev in Ukraine. And her research explores formal security evaluation approaches for smart home systems.
Hello, everyone.
Next, we have Luke Newton. He's a master's student and has a bachelor's degree in software engineering from Carleton University. And his research explores data-driven approaches to evaluate secure software architectures and designs.
Hi, everyone.
Joe Samuel is also a master's student. He also has a bachelor's degree in software engineering from Carleton University. And his research is in the area of data-driven system-level security evaluation.
Hey, everyone. Happy to be here.
Georgy Zakuriev is an undergraduate researcher, and he's a recipient of an NSERC Undergraduate Student Research Award. And his research is in the area of security and resilience for IoT-enabled smart city applications.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today.
And last but not least, Alvi is going to join us for this discussion as well. So Alvi has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the Islamic University of Technology in Bangladesh. And as we have seen from his earlier presentation, his research interests involve the use of formal methods and formal approaches to assess cybersecurity of critical infrastructures and industrial control systems.
Yeah, you all know me by now.
So to get our discussion started here, what I want to ask is, in your experience or in your opinion, what do you see as the most significant challenge of securing critical infrastructure?
I guess I can go ahead. So I would say that would be the integration of these new and emerging technologies with existing legacy systems. The reason behind that is when we combine many of our newer information technology systems with some of the older legacy OT systems or operational technology systems, we often don't consider the added risk of cyber attacks. And the moment these legacy systems are connected to this outward-facing network, they're already vulnerable. They're already vulnerable to cyber attacks. We already need to mitigate some threats. And this means that you not only have to protect your cyber infrastructure, but you also have to protect your physical infrastructure, as the system, again, as I mentioned earlier, inherits the vulnerabilities of both this IT and OT convergence. What's even more concerning is the fact that many of the tried and tested IT security frameworks that would work for IT systems do not work for OT systems. So because we have this IT-OT convergence again, just employing security measures for one of them is not going to be enough to protect our critical infrastructures. So yeah, that's what I think, and I'd definitely love to hear what some of the others think.
Yeah, to add to what Alvi just mentioned, I think one of the major challenges that we face as part of that results in this integration of new technologies over existing technologies is because a lot of these critical infrastructures have been built over decades. And from a point of time where it was mainly meant to be a closed loop system, something that is not supposed to be connected to the wider internet. And so the more that it's getting connected and smarter, it's important that we look at ways to secure them. And I think one of the major challenges that we face today that is often ignored is just the lack of awareness or training for a lot of the people involved. And just knowing, what are anomalies, what are things that shouldn't be happening can really go a long way in mitigating a lot of the attacks that these systems are prone to.
I guess I can jump in with my 2 cents on the matter. So based on my experience in the industry, some of the most significant challenges that occur within critical infrastructures actually directly relate to the lack of awareness and training of employees within an organization. So I actually want to give a specific example from my professional career just to support my point. However, before I do that, I just want to provide some background and mention that my experience originates from my internship in the federal government. I've worked with the cybersecurity team at the Parliament of Canada for about 4 years, and my role involved a number of responsibilities of a cybersecurity analyst. So I've spent a lot of time helping with the integration of various products and services within our corporate environment, but in particular, many of my assignments also focused on the continuous monitoring of our intrusion detection systems, and also on the investigation of cyber incidents affecting services that we offer to the members of the Parliament, who actually are some of the most important actors within the critical infrastructure of the Canadian government. So to come back to my example, in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, interestingly enough, our cybersecurity team actually saw a significant spike in the number of phishing email attacks, and they were directed at the members of the Parliament and other House of Commons administration staff. So these attacks definitely weren't a rare occurrence. We were used to seeing this kind of activity on a daily basis, anywhere from simple spam emails to some pretty creative examples, actually, where the phishing emails were very good at imitating messages from our internal departments, such as human resources or finance. Now, obviously, we had various kinds of tools in place, which were designed to detect and filter these kinds of attacks. However, the problem here was that this time, an increased number of these attacks were actually successful at bypassing our filters and firewalls, and unfortunately capturing pieces of personal information of the targets. So naturally, our immediate response was to patch our security software and intrusion detection systems. However, we actually decided to go one step further and initiated an entire cybersecurity awareness campaign. And basically, we imitated a variety of fake phishing emails and sent them out to all of our employees. And in addition to that, we also integrated an algorithm that would keep record of the individuals who would fall for the trap. So after executing the awareness campaign, our team personally reached out to each individual who became successful victim of the imitated attack and actually provided them with additional cybersecurity training and best practice guidelines. And let me just mention that several months down the road, although the amount of phishing attacks we received didn't reduce whatsoever, the number of them that was actually successful at capturing personal data decreased to less than a quarter of what we're used to seeing on a regular basis even before the increase we experienced alongside of the pandemic. And so what we deduced from this particular example was that the biggest weak link in our organization was in fact our end users. And although providing proper training for the employees can present a number of challenges, even a simple awareness campaign can significantly contribute to the process of securing our infrastructure. So I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say, so please go ahead.
Well, I have a bit of a different view in the matter. I think personally that the biggest challenge in securing our critical infrastructure is the size and complexity issue of our modern critical infrastructure, especially as we're introducing new services and functionality of the systems and bringing in OT systems like Joe and Alvi are talking about, and integrating them with the IT systems and starting to hook them up to the internet. So this increases the size quite greatly of the systems. And I also think it also increases the complexity, as many distributed systems are now being integrated with each other, and many of them are being developed independently of each other. So then piecing together these different systems across several different technologies and several different generations is quite difficult, and it leads to many vulnerabilities being introduced. And also I would say that many of the details get lost in translation for these complex systems, from the design phase, the implementation phase, the testing phase, to finally the deployment of these systems. So across the whole development cycle, there's many areas to introduce bugs and vulnerabilities. And that's why, like in Dr. Jaskolska's presentation, why we have to bake in security.
Yeah, so just to build off of this idea of size and complexity, we also want to think about the connectivity of all of these different components as well. Like James mentioned, you're bringing all of these components together, old systems and new systems, systems from different domains as well. And these things can interact with each other in unforeseen or unexpected ways. Right, and this can lead to a lot of very obscure threats that are difficult to deal with. And one of the big challenges about being a system designer or developer is that you want to make sure you can plug as many of these holes in your defense as possible. You want to catch as many of these threats, whereas your attackers only need to find one of these obscure threats to exploit.
Yeah, just to add a bit more to Luke and James's point about size and complexity. A large portion of our research in the Cyber C Lab involves formal methods to study the risk, the severity, or as it's seen before, the impact of cyber attacks. And these methods work fine when dealing with small subsections of such critical infrastructures, but when we have to deal with large real-world systems with millions of components, many of the analysis approaches become ineffective due to the limitations that we have because of our modern hardware and processing capabilities. So this certainly is a big problem.
To expand on that too, I'll just say one more thing. Like also the analyses of these systems, but also the evaluation of them by regulatory bodies or other third parties is also quite difficult. And as we can see from evaluations through the common criteria, is that a lot of these evaluations take many years, and they're quite tedious and take a long time to roll out to fully analyze the system and determine a certain level of assurance. But through these many years, right, through the evaluation, new threats are being released all the time, and the systems are being attacked. So almost, you know, the cycle has to repeat again. The reevaluation of a system has to happen almost as soon as it's complete. So new types of methods and tools are needed to automatically, or at least increase the frequency of these evaluations.
So I think we can see that there's quite a lot of challenges that need to be addressed in dealing with critical infrastructure protection. So what I want to ask, and some of you did touch on this already, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more, is what do you think might be the most effective way to practically secure critical infrastructures moving forward? What might be those approaches, techniques, however big or small they might be, that would basically capture an effective solution that would see some gains in improving the current state of critical infrastructure cybersecurity?
I think considering that most organizations behind these critical infrastructures are for-profit businesses, I think it's important to weigh things in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And I think as I touched on in the earlier point, helping raise awareness of security just across the organization, across the employees, cultivating that security culture within the organization can play a very important role without much of an overhead for the operators of these critical infrastructures. So I think that could play a pretty important role without costing too much.
Yeah, I would also say, again, raising awareness among the organization would be the single most effective way right now. Because when we look at many of the industries affected by cyber attacks recently, we can see that it often starts with a simple email. As Yo-Yo's talking about phishing emails and rise in those types of attacks. They take advantage of some of the employees being unaware or even slightly careless about the security aspect, and sometimes they're tricked into clicking a link, downloading a malware, revealing sensitive information about the organizations. And we can see that we really need to train these employees to let them know that these cybersecurity exploits can lead to several different impacts, and some of those can be catastrophic. We need to make them aware that there are these horrors that cybersecurity exploits bring. And we need to make them aware of their roles. We need practical and frequent exercises to keep reminding them of their responsibilities over and over again.
Yeah, I think Alvi reminded me of a good example that happened early in the year in Florida relating to the Florida water hack that thankfully was mitigated thanks to an employee's vigilance on the change of chemical values and chemical concentration in the way they treat their water supply. And it's things like that if that employee didn't catch manually, there were no other checks or boundaries to prevent that from affecting an entire city's water supply, and who knows where it could have gone from there. So I think even though that also highlighted a weakness in that social engineering was used to gain remote access in the first place, it also shows that effective training and just keeping them on their toes to know what to be aware of can be pretty useful in sort of being the first aid of saving from potential issues that could occur.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the most effective solution is a proper training within organizations or in governments. So that would also be to specialize individuals that are experts on using particular methods and analyzing the actual security of systems, and not just developing systems. Because I think a lot of the time in practice is a lot of the the security and securing an actual system gets put on the developers. And then where does that the responsibility lie is another question. But I think we need to make sure that we have proper training for these individuals, and we have specific teams for the analysis and modeling of systems, so we can ensure that security objectives of the organization are met. And also that in these teams that new techniques and tools are being used to analyze on the systems automatically, so we can verify specific things in our system are being met. And also related to the new approaches that we have, since the systems are much larger now and more complex, we have to find new tools and methods to divide and conquer, and new quantitative methods too that aren't more objective than subjective. So it's easier to reason that our system is secure.
And I guess if I were to give my input on this matter, I definitely agree with the direction of the discussion, because it kind of emphasized my previous point involving awareness and education exercises. Like, as I mentioned before, I personally believe that the end user represents one of the most significant vulnerabilities within our critical systems. And even for the most non-tech savvy users, establishing a culture of security by providing proper awareness and training can definitely go a long way, especially when it comes to the protection of valuable information and infrastructure components.
Yes, I agree with the guys that establishing and maintaining a security culture is one of the most important things we can do right now. And I would like to add that it will give employees the understanding of their own responsibility, which is quite important.
So there's an interesting comment came through the chat here that will lead us into our next question. So there's a comment that says, sounds like a bunch of computer scientists shifting the blame to people. So with that said, who is responsible for practically securing the critical infrastructures? Is it the owners and operators? Is it the system designers and integrators? Perhaps those computer scientists or engineers? Is it the regulatory authorities? Would it be someone like a third-party supplier of the different components that are used in these systems? Or perhaps someone else, all of the above, none of the above? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I believe it should be a good symbiosis, because everyone involved in practically securing critical infrastructure should be more or less equally responsible for doing it. Because with only a proper collaboration between all of these entities, we can achieve a really great result. Because like owners, they should be willing to accept new technologies. Operators should be willing to learn how to operate upgraded objects. And then designers, when designing, they should take into account efficiency and security at the same time. And then there's many other people that involved that should be responsible for securing it. So everyone should work together in order to achieve best results.
I'd have to agree with that. Although I do think that system designers and architects play an integral role within the scope of critical infrastructure security, I believe that actually authorities and management within the organization have an even bigger impact on the matter. Because you can have the most competent information technology team and the most bleeding edge security tools, but none of these would serve you any good without proper organization. Unfortunately, the exploitation of zero-day vulnerabilities is extremely hard to prevent, because by nature, attackers and adversaries are usually one step ahead of the game. And it all comes down to how proficient you are at handling incident response and remediation. Essentially, I think that regardless of how secure you believe that your systems are, at one point or another, a breach is inevitably going to occur and you need to be prepared. So when dealing with cybersecurity incidents, proper guidance from management and steering that prioritizes and focuses on directing and mitigating incident response workflows is absolutely crucial, which is why I have a strong opinion about the importance of good directives from our team leaders in terms of securing corporate environments and infrastructures.
Yeah, I think that comment is not necessarily true, and if it came out that way, that was, I don't think, the intention of our discussion, but rather, if anything, it highlights the cross-disciplinary nature of responsibilities for systems like these. There are different chains of commands and different protocols that need to be followed, and so they usually have a collection of problems that usually end up with catastrophic results that we've seen in attacks on critical infrastructure. Just a simple example of that is how even if system integrators or developers focus heavily on security, they fall under the constraints set up by their management, as Georgie mentioned. And so, and those management usually operate on objectives that may differ from what the government or the country actually needs. So I think even places like regulatory authorities could play a very important role in helping to sort of moderate that balance, ensure that there are sufficient checks and balances. And of course, that raises more questions as well. But I think that would be a great start to emphasize on the fact that it's a shared responsibility, especially for a system that many people really depend on. I think that would be my takeaway from it, at least.
Joe, I'm going to disagree with you and completely agree with the comment that the answer should really be everyone. And we are very good at shoving the responsibilities on others to lighten our own load. So I'm not a computer scientist, but yeah, I'm very good at doing that as well. So I'm going to do that one more time. If I had to pick one, so one side who's very responsible for practically securing those critical infrastructures, from my experience, I can tell that the system designers and integrators have a huge role to play. So as pointed out by Dr. Jaskolka earlier, that security needs to be built in from the very beginning. We can't just add it later, it just doesn't work that way. Yes, the owners make the decisions and the regulatory authorities enforce what we can or cannot do. in the end, it all comes down to the design decisions and falls on the shoulders of the system integrators to ensure the system security. And even if the third-party supplied components are secure by themselves, they do not guarantee the security of the system that they are being added to. Again, it depends on how they will be integrated into the system itself to keep the system adequately secure even after we make those modifications. So yeah.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Alvi here. I think that the system integrators and the developers, designers, and testers all have a bit more of an important role in the matter, as they're the ones who are actually putting in the mitigations and addressing the vulnerabilities and performing the risk assessments. And with those risk assessments, they also then pass it up the line to their managers and the other stakeholders to make the decisions about what assets to protect. So it's really important for them to translate the technical jargon appropriately to the higher management, so they're able to protect the most important assets or the ones that could lead to the most catastrophic consequences.
Yeah, so I think what a lot of this kind of comes back to is what was mentioned in the first presentation, which is there needs to be some kind of a bridge between the policymakers and the designers, because these are kind of the two things we're going back and forth saying here, right? You're ultimately, yes, your designers and developers are the ones who are making design decisions, which impact the security of the end product, but those are limited by whatever standards, regulations that you have to follow for your product. So ultimately, yeah, you need those designers to make good decisions, but you also need policymakers to be informed about, you need you need your policymakers to be informed on some of the technical aspects as well. And you need policies and standards that aren't too limiting with respect to what kind of liberties you can take on those technical decisions.
Just to add a bit more to this discussion, I also think that third-party partners and suppliers have a role to play here as well. So they're often the weakest link in the organizational security that we don't consider or forget. And we have the saying in security where the idea is your security is about as strong as the weakest link. So if we think about our systems, our industrial control systems, or critical infrastructures, a lot of them employ a lot of different third-party components, for example, programmable logic controllers and many others similar to that. And these third-party suppliers really don't have the incentive to create secure products. All they care about is the market, how fast they can get their products to the market, how competitive it's going to be. All they care about is the functionality and, again, making profits. But security is the last thing on their mind. So we have to make them aware of these necessities, and they definitely have a role to play. We need to make them aware that they have a role and they need to play that.
So it seems like we have a lot of different opinions about who's responsible for this, but I think we could probably all agree that it is a shared responsibility. And rather than saying who's most responsible, it's really, I think, the takeaway point from this last discussion question really is that everybody has a role to play. And the only way this is going to work is if everybody plays nice together, right? And I'll just bring it back because I think this emphasizes the point made in my earlier presentation where building bridges among these different stakeholders, getting them to speak the same language and to recognize the fact that they are all working towards a common objective and goal. This comment about shifting the blame back and forth between these different people is largely due to the fact that we don't understand really what everyone else is up to and what their goals and motivations are. We think they're always against us, right? As an engineer, you're thinking, oh, those policymakers are coming in and they're telling us we need to do things in a specific way and it's limiting all of the choices that I have to be innovative. And at the same time, the policymakers are saying we need to rope those people in and tell them this is exactly how it needs to be done, because otherwise they're going to run rampant and they're going to make all kinds of chaos. But the fact of the matter is that these groups are working towards the exact same objective. They want to develop a secure system. And once we recognize that these folks are working towards these common objectives and that they're not out to get one another, they're not at odds with each other, I think we can really take a lot of steps forward in addressing some of these issues. And I've been involved personally in some recent events that are getting together these policymakers, the engineers, the technical folks, the operators on the ground, and having these conversations that are really starting to be more productive about practical solutions. What will actually work for all of the stakeholders involved in these processes, rather than just going ahead and trying to dictate what needs to be done. It's rather a much more collaborative effort, taking the constraints of all of these different parties into consideration to come up with a solution that can actually be deployed. So I think this has been a great discussion so far. And what I want to do for the last little bit of our discussion here is sort of turn this and start thinking a bit more forward about how critical infrastructure is going to evolve and how we're going to start seeing new tools, technologies, techniques, such as artificial intelligence or machine learning, or the adoption of formal approaches, or more security automation and monitoring, or information intelligence and cyber threat intelligence sharing. Which of these, in your opinion, do you think has a major role to play and that we're going to start seeing more of as we move into the next, let's say, 10 years of critical infrastructure protection?
To get started here, I can go ahead. I personally think that the formal methods will be the forefront in the future, especially as the field expands. But we've seen in the past, and many people have talked about it, the formal methods is a good way to mathematically and objectively define your system and its different objectives. And to be able to, I think, and especially with future initiatives, is to be able to automatically verify individual parts of a system or a system as a whole. A particular formal methods technique that's quite close to me is the component-based software engineering approach, which kind of divides and conquers a system by changing the granularity and making components a representation of a system, and mathematically and formally describing it and then verifying it with our system and security objectives. And then this can also be employed during the whole design and testing and implementation phases of it. And I think what this leads to is of a good several verified software components, which then can be reused across multiple different product families, platforms. And then also we could maybe move and share it openly. So many people across different organizations and people across the world will be able to share these verified components and build their own systems and be confident that they'll operate efficiently in a natural environment.
I would also vote for formal methods. Adding to James's point of this automation capability and objectivity, formal methods can be applied from the very early stages of the system development with information as little as the system design descriptions or the requirement specifications. And they also have the advantage of being very exhaustive in their assessment of systems. So we have this added assurance that if we perform the analysis correctly, it will be sufficient to prove that the system is adequately secure. We can use these formal methods to quantify the risk, the severity, or the impact of the attacks. And we can use these, some of the metrics that we've defined or these concrete values to aid our design decisions. The only problem from the practical aspect, because we're talking about, again, the practically secure and critical infrastructures, is some of the scalability issues that formal methods have had for years. The current limitations, again, of modern computing hardware, this is, again, sort of reiterating some of the things that I've been saying earlier, it sort of limits what many of the existing formal methodologies can do. especially when we have to deal with massive real-world systems with components that are all interacting amongst each other.
Yeah, I think to add to those points, I think it's not necessarily one technique or tool that's going to be at the forefront, but it's more of a combination. And I think data analysis in general is going to be a pretty important part that it's already playing at the moment across critical infrastructure, but also in more systems to come. And that involves things like, applying machine learning into understanding anomaly detections, right, across your systems or monitoring critical assets. And part of my work actually involves helping the design phase of these types of systems to encompass data that we can that's available externally that we can use to monitor the design aspects of these systems and try to improve it from the design phase as well. And that could add to the methods discussed by James and Alvi in terms of formal methods. So I think it's always going to be a combination of tools and techniques depending on the types of infrastructure, the types of data that's available, and I think together they can help bolster the security of these types of systems.
So I guess to bring some contrast to the discussion, I personally want to emphasize the importance of the absolute basics, particularly the fundamental tools that are required to facilitate the operations of a cybersecurity team within an organization. And in that regard, I wanted to give a simple analogy. So I like to think of a security incident as a hole in the water dam. And the first thing you do is patch that hole in order to ensure that everything functions properly again and that there are no immediate impacts on the infrastructure. But afterwards, what you do is you go ahead and look on the other side of that dam because you want to find out where that hole actually came from and figure out how to prevent the incident from occurring again. And so I believe that without proper cybersecurity tools that are designed to help with security information and event management or intrusion detection, which basically allows to log and record malicious activity and forensic data, it's practically impossible to prevent cybersecurity incidents. Now, when you talk about tools, you have a number of latest trends in the industry that aim to modernize their functionality. And these include the virtualization of firewalls and other network functions, and the combination of monitoring and intrusion detection systems into a centralized management and incident response portal, which kind of goes in line with Dr. Jaskolka's earlier point about collaboration of manufacturers. However, that's a completely separate area of discussion, which we might not necessarily want to go into right now. But overall, my point is that although having qualified and competent analysts is incredibly important in terms of securing critical infrastructures, I think that without the fundamentals representing even the most basic tools for security analytics, it's next to impossible to apply the skills of your experts in a practical manner.
So I want to bring another issue here to the forefront because I personally see that there's going to be a larger need, and we've been pushing for this for a handful of years at least, to have the owners, operators of critical infrastructure to be engaged in more information sharing when they are the victim of a potential cyber attack, to share that information with other owners and operators so that they can take preventative actions. For example, I see these technologies enabling more real-time information sharing to be very important, because what there is currently is this perception that if, as an owner or operator of a critical infrastructure that has just been the victim of a cyber attack, that I don't want to disclose a lot of information about it because I'm a bit afraid about what the consequences are going to be for me, right? When I think about going to the regulatory authority, depending on what my infrastructure is, and telling them, hey, I was just the victim of a cyber attack, I might be a bit worried that they're going to slap me with a fine or something like this. And this has been the perception for a long time, despite a lot of regulatory agencies and government agencies saying, no, you're protected against this. We want you to share and to help improve the ecosystem as well. So do you have any thoughts on this idea of intelligence and information sharing?
Yeah, I think we can take a note from the privacy sector when we look at how, for example, in Canada, we have the privacy controller whose responsibility it is to permit these types of disclosures in a method that does not put the reporting company in a compromising position, and sort of incentivizes that idea of information sharing is better, not just for their own good, but just for the infrastructure and general health of that industry. I think we can draw some lessons from there and see how we can adapt such a methodology in critical infrastructure context.
Do we have any other thoughts on this issue? Otherwise, I do see a quick question in the chat here that I want to bring up. It's more of a, what are your thoughts? The human factor or massive system complexity, which do you think is a bigger issue? If we can just go around the group and maybe get your thought on this, that would be interesting to add to this discussion as well. Because I think you touched on both of those points quite extensively, but if you had to pick one, in your own opinion, which do you think it would be? Human factors or massive system complexity?
Well, in case of computer scientists and software-based tools, we don't really care about the human factor at all, to be honest. Like, all the systems, all the approaches, and everything that we develop in a way, we're kind of worried about the scalability of our system. So in that case, the size and the complexity of the system matters a lot. But at that point, we're not considering this human factor that can be very, very volatile, and that's very unpredictable. So because we're working with things that we know and things that can be estimated, we're not worried about the human factor at all. So that's like, if I had to pick one, that's my answer.
Yeah, I personally would abstain rather than pick a side, because the fact of the matter is it depends on the context, it depends on the system that we're talking about, how long it's been, how it's integrated. There's a whole number of variables there that we can't easily just generically conclude. But you know, I think at the end of the day, it's something to pay attention to very closely as well, right? That's why we touched on the points of awareness and training and that sort of thing, to make sure that, you know, we can't guarantee anything, because at the end of the day, humans are unique and they're diverse and they operate in different ways based on their own experiences. But I think as a whole, it's important to pay attention to those, because complexity in systems, as pointed out by some of the colleagues here, is that it can obscure some of the risks just because it's too complex to decipher, right? Either by system designers or anyone who's taking over, et cetera. So I think it's important to pay attention to both, and it's very context dependent.
You can't pick both, you have to pick one.
just to build off of this, you know, kind of idea of context dependency, right? You have to consider that there's a growing number of systems that are being more and more autonomous, right? So if you have a system that is, you know, a fairly autonomous entity and doesn't have a whole lot of user interaction with it, then the unpredictability of users isn't going to be such a big problem, because they simply aren't users, right? And this is a bit more of what some of the traditional like operational technology systems are. And so, whereas you have the IT systems where you have all of this, these issues a lot more with the people being the problem when you're securing the system. So I think part of the reason why Joe is abstaining from one or the other is because a lot of what we are focusing on is the convergence of both of this information technology side, where the people tend to be more of the problem, and the operational side, where it's more the size and complexity.
I'd have to agree with that. I mean, although these two things do go interchangeably, I think that like some of the most successful attacks were actually, at least in the initial stages, were achieved through methods of social engineering, right? However, you can argue the fact that a reason behind that is also the fact that a lot of these systems are very complex, and because of that, there's a lot more room for human error, which is why some of these exploits do occur.
I would also like to add that computer scientists are also humans, and if they do not consider operators who can make mistakes, we can also say that it's kind of a human factor.
Yeah.
Sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead, James.
I would like to say that I think actually, to be honest, that the human factor is probably the biggest one in my opinion, as the complexity of these systems can, I think, be handled eventually through our models and mathematically, but representing a human mathematically and trying to predict how they'll happen of what what they'll do is quite difficult. And then a lot of time in our systems, we still have an interface where a human will interact with it. So our software that we're developing and our systems are developing still have to be usable by the humans, although we can make sure it's all secure. Humans seem like they always find a way to break things. So we have to make sure that that when who's ever interfacing with our particular systems are also able to use it, and it's simple enough and not complex to them. Maybe in the background it could be complex, but we have to ensure that the complexity presented to the user is kept low.
Yeah, just to top it all off, I think to add to what Luke and Donna and James said, at the end of the day, a lot of these methods rely on a human factor already, right? And so the lack of accounting for certain things by the humans could result in issues even in an automated setting of certain operations and things like that. And one of the issues that James mentioned is, again, while a lot of these things can be modeled to certain extents mathematically, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. And that, again, arises or gives rise to more new issues and things like that.
And if I could share my thoughts on this too, a big human factor that none of our panelists talked about was the attacker, right? The attackers are often intelligent human adversaries, and they play a significant role in everything we've been discussing, right? A lot of the focus is sometimes on the defense, right? Is understanding how are we going to protect our systems? How are we going to defend? But you need to understand what your opponent is, right? You need to understand what are their motives, what are their incentives, why are they targeting a gas pipeline in the eastern United States? And there was an interesting article that said they weren't trying to cause disruption, they just wanted to make money, right? And it's sort of a very cheeky way of thinking about this, because those humans have an incentive. Their incentive was driven solely by the economics of the situation. And the fact that they come out and they say that they didn't intend to cause disruption is sort of a bit ridiculous in my own opinion, because how did you think that attacking a critical infrastructure in a major society in the United States, how did you think that was not going to cause disruption or was going to be an intended or an unintended consequence of your actions, right? So it just goes to show that the human factor is everywhere, right? It's everywhere as part of this. And one might also argue, and I think Badana mentioned this, is that the humans are the ones who made these massively complex systems, right? So there is that human factor. The designers are the humans, and I would very much agree with that point. So we can't lose sight of this. And this, and again, we have a panel here pretty much exclusively of engineers. And it's very easy for us to lose sight of this fact. And I think what I want to do is wrap up this discussion by just summarizing some of these points, right? Is that we see that the human factor is playing a major role in all of the challenges that we're facing in protecting critical infrastructure. And we summarize from the discussion that one of the most effective ways to protect our critical infrastructure is to have awareness, have training, to establish a culture of security among the people that are involved. And when we look at this problem more holistically, and as we can see from our discussion, we need to strive towards developing and employing these more cross-cutting, multifaceted, multidisciplinary solutions to address these wide varieties of security challenges and considerations that need to be taken into account when securing these critical infrastructures upon which we rely in our daily lives. So with that, I'm going to give a big round of applause and a big thank you to our panelists for this great discussion. Thanks to everyone who's been dropping in comments and questions in the chat for our session today. And has been a great experience to share our thoughts, our opinions, and some of the work that we're doing at Carleton University on this really important topic. So with this, I'm going to also mention a big thank you to the organizers of this fantastic event, and a big thank you to all of the viewers today for participating in this event. And with that, we're going to sign off, and we're going to say thanks a lot and see you perhaps next year. So thanks to our panel again, and thanks to everyone else.